Ancus Marcius was, in many ways, a king that embodied both sides of Roman society. He did not shy away from war. In fact, he did more to expand Rome's borders than any other king save maybe Romulus. However, he was also not quite as consumed with war as, say, Tullius Hostilius. In the same vein as Numa Pompilius, who was actually Ancus's maternal grandfather, Ancus furthered the development of Rome's religious traditions and rituals. Ancus was the first Roman ruler said to be competent in both waging war and prospering during peacetime. And yet, the way that Ancus came to the throne is a little suspicious. Let's talk about it. Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Also, follow me on Twitter to get updates about any videos in progress. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. I again just want to put in a quick notice that we should take these stories with a bit of skepticism. Many of the deeds, and even the people themselves in the histories of this period, may not have been real, or may not have happened in the way we are told. Just keep that in mind as we talk about Ancus. Ancus Marcius came to the throne in 640 BCE. Ancus' mother was Pompilla, a daughter of Numa Pompilius, while his father was Numa Marcius, the man who served as Praefectus Urbi under Tullius Hostilius. Ancus was a Sabine, which meant that we were now up to 2 Roman kings and 2 Sabine kings of Rome. We don't quite know when he was born, but we can make some assumptions. It is completely possible that Ancus was born during the reign of his predecessor, Tullius Hostilius. Remember, Tullius came to power in 672 BCE. If we assume that Ancus was born in the same year, then Ancus would have been 32 when he came to power in 640. We should also remember that Ancus's paternal grandfather, Numa Marcius, was a contemporary of Tullius. Numa Marcius was the Pontifex Maximus during the reign of Numa Pompilius, and competed with Tullius Hostilius for the position of king. It would then make sense that Numa's grandson would have been born after Tullius's ascension to the throne. We certainly have some room for error here, as 32 would have been quite young for a Roman king. In any case, we should certainly spend some time talking about Ancus's ascension. If you haven't seen the previous episode talking about Tullius, I would recommend that you at least go watch the last few minutes of that episode, as the 2 events are really linked. You can find that video in the upper right hand corner of the screen. If you can recall, the story of Tullius's death had 2 differing versions. The first had to do with the Roman gods and their anger over missed sacrifices. The second is based around Ancus Marcius and his plot to kill Tullius and his family. This second version is the story we want to talk about today. Tullius died in 640, and Ancus took the throne in 640 as well. Unlike the previous elections, where there was, in the case of Numa Pompilius, much recorded debate, and in the case of Tullius, at least one named competitor, we have no such record of competition for Ancus. This seems very strange if we assume that Ancus was the person to kill Tullius, as surely Tullius had some supporters in the Senate and among the people, who would kick up a big fuss if Tullius's killer tried to take the throne. You know what this story sounds like to me? Well, it sounds like a coup. I mean, just picture it. Ancus and his co-conspirators kill Tullius, thus emptying the throne. After this, Ancus either ascends to the throne through threats of violence or has enough allies in the Senate to push his nomination through. This would explain why it seemed like there was no opposition to someone who had just killed his king. Could we be looking at the first Roman coup, very nearly 600 years before the assassination and coup of Julius Caesar? To me, it certainly seems to make sense. I'd love to know what you think down in the comments. Regardless of whatever way that Ancus came to the throne, he now held the power of the Roman king. Livy, our primary source for basically all the information on the Roman kings, states that Ancus's first act was to order the Pontifex Maximus to copy the text written by Numa Pompilius on how to perform several rituals, feasts, and other such religious activities onto wooden tablets that would then be displayed to the public. This was done with the hope that no Romans would ever neglect or perform the rites incorrectly. This seems to line up pretty well with the mythological story of Tullius's death, as remember, he was said to be struck down because the people of Alba Longa, who he had welcomed into Rome, had not made the proper sacrifices and rites for the gods. It would make sense then that Ancus felt it important to ensure that something like that can never happen again. However, if we stick with our theory of a coup committed by Ancus, perhaps this was all just a useful cover-up. Maybe Ancus used this action as a way to push the Roman population towards believing that Tullius had actually died because of the gods. As I already said, it would make sense if Tullius died via the gods, that his successor would want to ensure that would never happen again. Perhaps this was all a ruse to try and convince the Romans that he had nothing to do with Tullius' death. Of course, this is all just my own speculation, and I would love to know what you think about this theory. Let me know down below. At some point in Ancus' reign, he began a campaign against the Latin League that would last for almost his entire reign. The Latin League was a, at times loose and at times strong, confederation of Latin cities located around Rome. The League was established by the city of Alba Longa and operated as a defensive organization against outside groupings of people, mostly the Etruscans. The original cities that founded the League were Tusculum, Arcia, Lanuvium, Lavinium, Cora, Tibur, Pometia, and Ardea. By the time of Ancus' reign, it is a little unclear how many cities made up the League, but we know that it had expanded. The Latins believed that Ancus would continue the tradition of his grandfather, Numa Pompilius, and be a peaceful and introspective king. With this supposed weakness in mind, the Latins made several incursions into Roman territory. When Roman diplomats and embassies made demands for restitution, the Latins refused, and Ancus declared war. Livy states this was the first time that the Romans used a fetile to declare war. A fetile was a type of priest of Jupiter that advised the Senate on matters of foreign policy. They were also the people to make formal declarations of war in the name of, at this point, the king. The fetile was responsible for conducting the ritual needed to declare war. The ritual was as follows. He was to announce Roman demands using a series of predetermined phrases. First, at the enemy's border with Rome, then when he passed over the borders, again to the first man he meets, again on entering the enemy's gate, and again on entering whatever government building in the presence of local magistrates. If the demands were not met, the pater paterus, the priest sent to deliver the demands, declares war within 33 days, and returns to Rome to await the resolution of the king and senate. Once they have resolved to go to war, the fetile returns to the enemy border carrying a javelin with a steel or fire-hardened tip and dipped in blood. He declares war on the enemy and throws the javelin into their territory. It is believed that this was the first war to be subject to such a ritual. After the ritual was conducted, Ancus marched from Rome at the head of an army. His first stop was the town of Politorium. Ancus easily took the city, however he didn't just stop there. Ancus ordered the town's population to return to Rome and settle on the Aventine Hill. This was actually fairly normal for Rome to do. Remember what happened to the Sabines and the Albans. The other Latins would quickly repopulate the city, and Ancus would return and this time completely demolish the city. The villages of Telene and Ficana, we aren't too sure where they were located, but we can assume they were somewhere around Politurum, would also be sacked during this time. The story is strikingly similar to the story of the destruction of Alba Longa by Tullius Hostilius. It would seem that Rome quite liked to engage in a bit of forced immigration. If these stories are true, and that's a pretty major if, then it really makes sense. Remember, we only consider the Romans different from the Latins today because they would eventually triumph over the Latins, and the region would become dominated by Romans. However, at this point, the Romans were Latin, both culturally and ethnically. The Romans would have thought of those that they conquered in this war, and in the wars of Tullius, as brothers, or at least distant family. Thus, it really shouldn't be surprising that they would be happy to welcome them to Rome, and even give them positions in the aristocracy of Rome. Personally, I wonder if maybe these events are not just representations of large migrations of Latin peoples to Rome. Perhaps the cities of Alba Longa and Politurum were invaded by the Etruscans, or some other group, or maybe they suffered some sort of famine or natural disaster, and instead of trying to rebuild, they fled to Rome, where they were welcomed with open arms. Or maybe Livy was completely right, and the Romans just loved to forcibly migrate the Latin populations of the cities they conquered. In any case, Ancus now moved on to the town of Medulla. Livy states that Medulla was very well fortified, with a very strong garrison. Details about the battles are very light, but we are told that several engagements took place, and eventually the Romans won the city. Afterwards, the Latins and the Romans made peace, and Ancus returned to Rome with, quote, a large amount of loot. As already stated, the Latins from the various conquered towns were settled around the Aventine Hill and made citizens. After this war with the Latin League, we are told that Ancus celebrated a triumph. This information comes from the Fasti Triumphalis. This was essentially a calendar that recorded the date of every Roman triumph. The portion for the regal period is incomplete. We have 3 for Romulus. However, it is fairly commonly believed that Romulus didn't celebrate a triumph in the traditional sense. And then, 11 missing entries. This is actually a really interesting piece of missing Roman history. If we assume that the 3 for Romulus are all that he received, those 11 have to be divided between Numa Pompilius and Tullius Hostilius. Numa supposedly never went to war, and we only have records of 2 wars for Tullius Hostilius, the war against Alba Longa and the war against Veii. So if we assume that Tullius celebrated a triumph for both of those, we are left with 9 missing triumphs. So what were these 9 other triumphs? I have no idea. Maybe Numa wasn't as peaceful as we are led to believe. Maybe Tullius or Romulus received more triumphs than we think. Perhaps this is proof that there were more kings between Romulus and Ancus. I really don't know, and I'm not sure that we will ever know. However, it really is interesting to think about. After his triumph, Ancus integrated the Janiculum, a hill outside the traditional boundaries of the city of Rome, into the city. This hill was on the west bank of the Tiber, and it seems that Ancus extended control over the hill to dissuade any Etruscans from attacking Rome, as now Rome held command over both sides of the Tiber. Ancus fortified the hill with a strong wall, and connected the hill to Rome with a bridge named the Pons Sublicius. This is the earliest known bridge of Rome. Ancus also created a series of ditches around the Janiculum. Quick note here, ditches are seriously underrated as a historical defense. They were actually extremely effective and essentially negated cavalry. Anyway, Ancus would also build Rome's first prison, the Mamertine prison. It would be used for centuries afterwards. In fact, Simon Bar Gira, a Jewish political leader, would be imprisoned in the Mamertine in 70 CE. That's over 600 years later. The last act of real note by Ancus was the founding of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber River. Ostia would become the port city for Rome, and was vitally important for much of its history. It is debatable if this is true, as the oldest building found in Ostia only dates back to the 4th century BCE, some 200 years after Ancus' death. However, Livy tells us that Ancus was the person to found Ostia. Ancus would die in 616 BCE, reportedly from natural causes. It seemed like he would be succeeded by one of his 2 sons. However, his most trusted advisor, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, ensured that the sons were absent from Rome at the time of their father's death. Lucius convinced the people and Senate of Rome that he should be elected over Ancus' sons, as they were, quote, still youths. This actually does kind of make sense, as we know that Ancus felt the need to appoint Lucius as his son's guardian in his will, so we can probably safely assume that the boys were indeed young. However, this would make Lucius the first Roman king to successfully lobby for the kingship, but more on that in the next episode. Ancus left behind a legacy that mixed the best of those who came before him. He was not afraid to wage war, but he understood that Rome also needed to focus on internal development. Ancus was the product of the labors of Romulus and Numa Pompilius, and he represented what Rome could be, a vicious enemy, but also a prospering and peaceful people. Sadly, this legacy was not to last. The last kings of Rome were not nearly as great as Ancus proved to be, and we are nearing the end of the Roman monarchy. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you have any comments or questions on the video or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below. And please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.